Emily Bennett's life began in a forgotten corner of the South, a place so far removed from the world's bustling cities that even the name of the town no longer graced any maps. It was a small farming community in Kentucky, where the only sounds were those of the wind rustling through the tall grasses and the soft hum of crickets on summer nights. Born in 1948, Emily's arrival into this world was marked by an absence that would define much of her life. She was raised in the shadow of loss. Her mother, Celeste, died during childbirth, leaving Emily with nothing but memories her father, Thomas Bennett, could never fully recount. She never felt the warmth of her mother's embrace, nor did she ever hear her mother's voice lull her to sleep. Instead, she grew up in a house that was filled with her father's love and his wisdom, even if it lacked the nurturing touch of a mother. Her father, a stoic yet kind-hearted man, worked tirelessly on their small farm, growing corn, wheat, and beans, and raising chickens and pigs when the seasons allowed. While they never had much, Emily always had enough. Enough food on the table. Enough love to fill the gaps her mother left behind. Her father's teachings were simple but profound. "The earth is generous to those who respect it, Emily," he would say as they worked side by side in the fields. "You put in a tiny seed, take good care of it, and it gives you back a plant full of life. People are like that too. When you give love, you get love in return." He showed her how to plant the seedlings, how to care for the crops, and how to harvest what they had grown. But more than the farm itself, it was his love and respect for her that shaped Emily's early years. He made sure that she never felt the sting of her mother's absence too deeply. Still, Emily's childhood wasn't without its challenges. She had no dolls made of plastic or clothes from the stores. Instead, her toys were crafted from the very resources her father had on hand: corn husks turned into dolls, with scraps of fabric for dresses. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a little girl who didn't know anything else. The community around them was close-knit, and though Emily didn't have the same things as the other girls, she never went without affection or care. But as the years went by, Emily began to feel the weight of her loneliness. While the other girls braided each other's hair, talked about the boys in town, or learned to sew with their mothers, Emily was often reminded that she had no mother of her own. She learned to be independent early on, spending much of her free time running barefoot through the woods, learning which plants healed and which ones could kill, and listening to the stories the elders shared under the full moon. It was a simple childhood, but in its own way it was also a happy one. It wasn't until Emily turned 15 that the tranquility of her life was shattered. Her father, Thomas, who had passed the age of 50, met a woman named Sarah at the county fair in Springfield. Sarah was a widow too, about 20 years younger than him, with soft-spoken words and a smile that seemed to hide something deeper. Unlike the women in their small town, she wore red lipstick, had painted nails, and smelled of store-bought perfume. She told Emily's father that she had come from Chicago to seek a quieter life in the country, and she charmed him with her stories of the big city. Emily's first instinct was not jealousy but something darker. A premonition that crawled up her spine like an icy hand. Something about Sarah didn't sit right with her, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Still, who was she to say anything? Her father deserved companionship, and Sarah, with her soft words and attention, seemed to be exactly what he needed. Sarah appeared genuinely interested in his stories and admired his work on the farm. It didn't take long for Sarah to move in with them, and 6 months later, Emily's father married her in a quiet ceremony at the town's little church. At first, Sarah made an effort to get along with Emily. She cooked Emily's favorite dishes, bought her a new dress, and even taught her how to apply lipstick, encouraging her to look prettier for the boys. But Emily could see through the facade. Her eyes never truly smiled when Sarah smiled at her. And when her father wasn't around, Sarah would simply ignore Emily, as if she were invisible. Emily tried her best to be kind to Sarah. She helped with chores without complaint, complimented her cooking, and listened attentively to the stories she shared about her life in the city. But no matter how hard she tried, there was always a wall between them, built by mistrust and unspoken resentment. Her father, bless him, didn't notice. Or perhaps he didn't want to. He was so infatuated with Sarah that he refused to see what was obvious to Emily. He brushed off her concerns, calling it mere jealousy. "You'll see, Emily. Sarah's a blessing for us. She's good for me. Good for both of us." But Emily knew better. She could feel it deep in her gut that Sarah wasn't what she seemed. and soon her worst fears would be realized. Sarah's arrival in their home brought an unexpected shift to the daily rhythms of Emily's life. At first, Emily tried to convince herself that perhaps her father's new marriage would bring some much-needed joy into their small household. After all, he had worked so hard for so long alone, and Sarah seemed to bring a kind of energy he had been missing. She was lively, youthful, and full of stories about a world far removed from the simple farming life they led. Emily, however, could not ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled in her heart the moment Sarah had stepped into their home. Sarah was unlike anyone Emily had ever met. She had lived in the city, traveled far and wide, and spoke with a confidence that Emily had never seen in the women of their town. She wore expensive perfume and carried herself with an air of sophistication. Emily often found herself wondering how someone like Sarah had ended up in such a small town. Was she truly seeking a quiet life, or was there something else? She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Sarah was hiding something, but she couldn't articulate what that was. Still, Emily kept her distance, afraid to speak out against her father's happiness. She wanted to believe that Sarah was simply the woman her father had fallen in love with, the one who could help him in his later years feel less lonely. As the months went by, Emily observed Sarah's behavior more closely. It wasn't so much what Sarah did that made Emily wary, but what she didn't do. Sarah's smiles were always too perfect, her gestures a little too rehearsed. When Emily was present, Sarah would act kind, even affectionate, but the moments they spent alone together were different. Emily couldn't help but notice how Sarah would turn cold, as if the warmth she offered in front of her father was nothing more than a performance. One of the most glaring things Emily noticed was how Sarah seemed to view her more like a nuisance than a daughter. When her father was not around, Sarah would ignore her completely, as if Emily wasn't even there. There were times when Emily would enter the room to find Sarah making herself comfortable in their living space, with a cup of tea or a book, but the moment Emily walked in, Sarah's eyes would narrow slightly, and she would go back to whatever she had been doing, pretending that Emily was invisible. Despite her father's assurances that Sarah was a blessing, and that Emily should learn to love her as a mother, Emily couldn't force herself to accept Sarah. The walls between them were thick, and no amount of false pleasantries or carefully curated kindness could break them down. The more Emily tried to reach out, the colder Sarah became. Emily soon realized that her role in Sarah's life was not as a daughter, but as an inconvenient presence. Sarah's hold on her father grew stronger with every passing day. Emily noticed that her father was slowly slipping away from the person she had known. He was no longer the man who had taught her to plant seeds, to work the land, and to respect nature. Now he was the man who sat quietly in front of the fire, listening to Sarah talk about the grand life she had once lived. He hung on every word, like a student listening to the teachings of a wise professor. Emily could see the way Sarah's influence was pulling him further and further from the life they had shared. And with every little change, Emily's anxiety grew. It was during one of their quiet dinners that Emily first heard Sarah mention something that made her blood run cold. Sarah had been speaking in her soft, honeyed voice, recounting some story from her life in the city, when she suddenly said, "I had to leave behind a lot of things when I came here. But I'm happy to be with Thomas. We'll be okay." Thomas, her father, had never mentioned anything about leaving things behind. Emily's ears perked up as she wondered what exactly Sarah had been talking about. The thought lingered in her mind, but she dared not ask. Not yet. One evening, Emily decided to confront her father about Sarah. She had to know what was going on, even if it meant risking his anger. After dinner, when the kitchen was quiet and the only sound was the crackling of the fireplace, Emily found the courage to ask him about Sarah's past. "Dad, I've been thinking," Emily began, her voice shaky. "Is Sarah really all that she says she is? She talks so much about the city, about things we don't know. Do you know everything about her?" Her father looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Emily, my dear, Sarah's been through a lot. She's seen things, lived in places you and I could never imagine. She's just trying to make a life here with me. I know it's different for you, but she's good for me. I can tell." Emily's stomach twisted as he spoke. She could see it now, the subtle charm Sarah had cast over him, the way she had turned his world upside down without him even realizing it. He was so enchanted by her, so desperate for companionship in his later years, that he couldn't see what Emily had come to fear. that Sarah had an agenda far beyond the surface-level stories she told. In the following weeks, Emily's suspicions grew as she watched her father continue to fall under Sarah's spell. She was more convinced than ever that something was wrong, that Sarah wasn't just a woman who had come to town looking for a quiet life. There was something darker behind her charm, something Emily couldn't quite place, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface. The cold winter of 1965 brought more than just frost to Emily's life. It brought a devastating blow that would change everything. Her father, Thomas Bennett, had always been the backbone of their family. His quiet strength, his wisdom, his unwavering love for Emily. He was the man who had taught her everything she knew about life. But that winter he fell ill. It started with a cough, just a small tickle in his throat. But it quickly worsened, and within days, his fever rose to dangerous heights. Thomas wasn't one to complain. He was a rugged man who had worked the land his entire life. A man who had weathered storms, droughts, and hard winters with grit and resilience. But this was different. This sickness drained him. His once strong frame became frail, and his voice, usually so steady, trembled when he spoke. Emily knew something was terribly wrong, but her father refused to see a doctor. "It's just a cold, Emily," he would insist, his voice weak but insistent. "I'll be fine in a few days." But days turned into weeks, and still Thomas didn't improve. Instead, he grew weaker with each passing day. And Emily found herself unable to watch the man who had been her everything deteriorate before her eyes. One cold evening, after another of Thomas's restless nights, Emily returned home from a trip to the local store to find Sarah standing in the doorway, looking pale. She didn't need to say anything. The terror in Sarah's eyes told Emily everything she needed to know. Her father was gone. The shock of losing her father hit Emily like a freight train. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, and everything she had known, everything she had ever trusted, was gone in an instant. Sarah's tears flowed freely, but Emily saw through the act. Sarah had always been a woman who could turn on the waterworks when needed, but Emily knew her too well. The woman didn't grieve. She simply performed. The funeral was swift. The townsfolk had little time to prepare, and the cold air made it difficult to keep the mourners at the cemetery for long. Emily's heart ached as she stood by the simple grave, watching the earth fall into the hole where her father lay, his body now cold and still. Sarah clung to her, sobbing loudly, but Emily barely felt the woman's arms around her. She felt detached, numb, as though she were standing outside herself, watching the events unfold like a bad dream. It was only after the funeral, when the last of the neighbors had gone home, that the true horror of the situation became clear. Sarah, with a coldness Emily had never seen before, wiped away her tears as if dusting off a piece of furniture. She took a long drag from a cigarette, her eyes narrowing as she exhaled smoke. "Sit down, Emily," Sarah ordered, her voice hard and sharp now. "We need to talk." Confusion and dread filled Emily's chest. She sank into a chair at the kitchen table, still reeling from the loss of her father, unable to understand what was happening. Sarah's cold demeanor only deepened Emily's sense that something was terribly wrong. "Your father wasn't the man you thought he was," Sarah said, her voice calculated and emotionless. "He had debts. A lot of them. And they're not the kind of people you want to owe money to." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean, debts?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad was always careful with money. He worked hard, he made sure we never owed anything." Sarah's lips curled into a cold, mirthless smile. "That's the problem. He worked too hard but never made enough. He gambled, Emily. He bet everything he had trying to make more. But he lost. And now those people want everything, our land, our home. And if they don't get it, they'll take something else." Emily's mind spun. It couldn't be true. Her father was a man of honor, a man who never gambled, never even played cards. This was all a lie, a terrible lie. But before she could protest, Sarah continued. "The men your father owed are coming tomorrow. They want everything, our home, the land. But I've made an arrangement." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes glinting coldly. "They're willing to forgive the debt if you go to work for them. They have a big ranch and they need women to cook, clean, and take care of things. It's the only way we can save what's left." "Work for them," Emily repeated, her heart hammering in her chest. "What kind of work?" Don't ask questions, Emily. Just go. You'll work for them, and in time the debt will be settled. Where do they want me to go? Emily demanded, her voice shaking with disbelief. How long will I have to stay there? Sarah's eyes hardened. I don't know. Could be a year, maybe 2. The debt your father owed was deep. But if you don't go, they'll take everything. And you'll end up on the street. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. This was madness. This couldn't be happening. Her father had worked so hard, lived so honestly, and now in his death, she was being forced into a life she didn't understand. What if I don't go? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A chill ran through her when Sarah's gaze turned icy. Then they take the land and they'll take you. Emily, do you think they'll hesitate? They've been waiting for this day for a long time. They don't care about your father's good intentions. They only care about what they can take from us. Emily's stomach churned as Sarah's words sank in. She was being sold. It wasn't about work or paying off debts. It was about her being traded as property. The realization hit her like a physical blow. And for the first time, she understood the true depths of Sarah's betrayal. Sarah had never cared for her father, for Emily. She had only cared about what she could gain from their misfortune. The room seemed to close in around her. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight. But the reality of the situation was too overwhelming. There was no way out. Sarah had already made the arrangements, and the men were coming tomorrow. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she realized there was nothing she could do. Her father, the man who had always protected her, was gone. And now she was alone in a world that would swallow her whole. The next morning the sky hung heavy with gray clouds, and the chill of winter seemed to press in on Emily's heart. As she sat in the small, dimly lit kitchen, she tried to make sense of Sarah's words. Her mind raced with confusion, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Her father, honest, hardworking Thomas Bennett, couldn't have been involved in gambling, could he? It didn't fit the man she knew. But as the day wore on and the reality of her situation began to sink in, Emily couldn't escape the feeling that Sarah wasn't just lying to her. There was something more sinister behind her words, something that went beyond the so-called debts her father had supposedly left behind. She needed to understand the truth. She had to know what had really happened, why Sarah was so insistent on sending her away, and what debts her father could possibly have owed that would lead to her being sold. Emily spent the rest of the day searching through her father's things. She started with the small wooden chest that sat at the foot of his bed. It had always been locked, but now with her father gone, she felt an urgent need to open it. The key was tucked inside a drawer, hidden beneath a pile of old letters, and Emily's hands trembled as she slid it into the lock. Inside the chest were her father's journals, a few photographs, and a stack of letters. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes landed on something that made her blood run cold. There, written in her father's neat handwriting, was a series of transactions, names, dates, amounts. These weren't records of a man struggling with debts. These were notes on loans, deals, and agreements that made no sense. There were references to men Emily didn't recognize, names that seemed foreign to her. One name in particular caught her eye, Jacob Calloway. It was the name of a man Sarah had mentioned in passing the night before, a businessman who had supposedly made the deal to take Emily away. As she read the entries, it became clear to her that her father had indeed borrowed money, large sums, yet the reasons behind it were never explained in full. It was all in code, as though her father had been careful not to reveal too much. But the debts weren't gambling debts, and they certainly weren't the result of poor financial decisions. These were business dealings that had spiraled out of control. Her father had become entangled with people far more dangerous than Sarah had ever let on. The more Emily read, the more she realized that the debts had been structured in a way that left no room for escape. It seemed that her father had tried to make payments, tried to fix the situation, but the interest was too high, and the men he was dealing with were too powerful. In the final months of his life, it became apparent that these men had been tightening their grip on him, and Sarah, Emily's own stepmother, was somehow involved. She had played a role in this elaborate scheme to take everything from Emily and her father. As the afternoon wore on, Emily couldn't shake the anger building inside her. The life she thought she had known, the love and security she had once felt, was nothing more than a facade. Her father had been manipulated and controlled, perhaps without even realizing it. And Sarah had been the one pulling the strings, orchestrating the entire plan. She wasn't a helpless widow looking for companionship. No, she was a woman with her own agenda. And that agenda had been laid bare in the letters Emily had just uncovered. But Emily knew one thing for sure now. She couldn't trust Sarah, and she couldn't let herself be sold like cattle. This wasn't just about paying off debts. It was about power, control, and manipulation. Emily had been nothing more than a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. And now she had to decide what to do next. The door to the house creaked open, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the sound of the truck's engine earlier, but now it was real. The men were here. The men Sarah had made her deal with. She could hear the muffled voices outside, followed by the sound of boots on the porch. They were coming for her. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she froze. She felt trapped, powerless against the forces that were closing in around her. She wanted to scream, to run, to somehow escape from this nightmare. But there was no way out. She was stuck, and the world outside seemed like a place where escape was nothing more than a distant dream. But as she stood there, holding the letters in her trembling hands, something shifted inside her. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a quiet resolve. Emily wasn't going to let Sarah or these men control her life. She wasn't going to be a victim of someone else's scheme. No, she was going to take control of her own destiny, even if it meant risking everything. She stuffed the letters back into the chest and slammed it shut. There was no time to waste. The men were coming, and Emily knew she had to act fast. If she stayed, they would take her, and there would be no coming back. But if she could get away, even for a little while, she might find a way to make them pay for what they had done to her. Her heart racing, Emily grabbed a small bundle of clothes from her father's old closet and stuffed them into a sack. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay here. Not with Sarah and not with these men. She had to escape. As she slipped out the back door and into the woods behind the house, Emily's mind was focused on one thing: survival. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to face it on her own terms. She was no longer going to let anyone control her life. She was free for the moment, and that was enough. The night was cold and silent as Emily ran through the woods behind her family's farm. The only sounds were the crunch of fallen leaves under her boots and her heavy breathing. Desperate to escape the life she had known, she didn't look back. The fear of being caught and taken back was too great, and the pain of losing everything was still too fresh. She had to keep moving. She had to get away. But despite the chill of the air, Emily couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline and determination. She had been betrayed, manipulated, and controlled by those she trusted most. Now she was on her own. She was free, or at least she thought she was. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, and Emily had no real destination in mind. She simply ran, hoping that somehow she could outrun the horrors that had been forced upon her. But as the night wore on and the darkness deepened, her resolve began to waver. The exhaustion from the stress of the past few days, combined with the physical toll of running through the woods for hours, began to wear her down. She stumbled, tripping over a tree root, and landed hard on the ground. For a moment Emily lay there, catching her breath, staring up at the night sky. Her mind was racing with thoughts of escape, but the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had no money, no plan, and no idea how far the men would go to track her down. Would they send dogs after her? Would Sarah come looking for her, demanding that she return and face her fate? Suddenly, a vehicle's headlights cut through the darkness, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. She knew she had to get up and move. She couldn't be seen. She scrambled to her feet, panic rising in her chest. She darted into the brush, hoping to stay hidden, but her breath was ragged, and her feet were heavy with exhaustion. As the truck passed by, Emily's stomach churned. The vehicle was moving slowly, and its headlights swept across the woods, illuminating everything in their path. Emily pressed her back against a tree, praying that she wouldn't be spotted. She could hear the engine rev, the tires crunching against the gravel road, and she knew that if she didn't move soon, she would be caught. When the truck finally passed, Emily exhaled a shaky breath. She wasn't sure if they had seen her or not, but she couldn't afford to wait and find out. She kept moving deeper into the woods, trying to stay hidden. But with each step, the reality of her situation settled heavily in her chest. She had run out of options. She didn't know how long she walked for. But when dawn finally broke, she found herself in an unfamiliar part of the woods. There was no sign of the truck anymore, no sign of the men who had been chasing her. The only thing that surrounded her was the stillness of the morning light. It was then that Emily realized just how alone she was. The vastness of the world outside her home seemed overwhelming, and the thought of finding a way to survive in it terrified her. She had no family to turn to, no friends to help her. The life she had known was gone, and in its place was an uncertain future filled with danger. But there was no turning back now. She had made the decision to run, to escape. And now Emily had to figure out what came next. She walked for miles trying to find shelter. The first few hours were exhausting. Her body ached from the constant motion, and her mind was clouded with fear. But eventually, she stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin nestled in a clearing. Its windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, but it was a place to rest, at least for the moment. Emily approached cautiously, peering inside to make sure no one was there. The cabin seemed empty, and as she pushed the door open, she stepped inside. The place was dusty and neglected, but it offered a sense of safety. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, but for now it would have to do. She sat on the floor trying to calm her racing heart. As she rested, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. Her father was gone. Her home was no longer hers. And the men she had been sold to were still out there, searching for her. Emily didn't know how long she stayed in that cabin, but by the time she finally ventured out again, she was no longer running from fear alone. She had a new purpose: survival. And in that moment, survival meant getting as far away from the farm, from Sarah, from the men who had taken everything from her. She would leave behind the past and start over, even if it meant facing an unknown future. As Emily walked away from the cabin, a cold wind blowing through the trees, she couldn't help but feel a sense of determination she had never known before. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting back. Emily didn't look back as she left the cabin behind, her heart thudding in her chest, her mind consumed by a single thought: survival. She kept her head down as she moved, avoiding the roads and sticking to the dense woods and overgrown paths that led deeper into the unknown. She didn't know where she was going or how long it would take her to get there, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back now. She had crossed a line, and there was no returning to the life she had once known. It was a couple of days before she encountered another soul. A truck passed by the area she had been hiding in, and Emily instinctively ducked into the brush, her heart racing. The fear that gripped her was more than just fear of being caught. It was fear of what she had left behind, the terror of the men who would stop at nothing to get her back. After hours of walking, she found herself at the edge of a small town. It was early evening, and she felt the weight of her isolation press in on her. She was hungry, exhausted, and more alone than she had ever felt in her life. But she knew she couldn't afford to stop now. She needed to keep moving, even if she didn't know where she was headed. The next morning, Emily stumbled into a rundown diner on the edge of the town. It was small, the walls lined with faded photographs and peeling paint. A few people sat at the counter, nursing cups of coffee, their voices low and distant. Emily felt out of place, as though everyone in the room could sense she didn't belong. She was just a girl in torn clothes with no money, no place to stay, and no plan. The waitress behind the counter looked at her with curiosity but said nothing as Emily ordered a cup of coffee and some toast, hoping to blend in. She paid for the meal with the little cash she had left, just a few dollars that she had scavenged from the cabin. It was there, sitting in the corner of the diner, that she overheard a conversation that would change everything. "Did you hear about the girl they brought in from the farm?" one of the patrons said, his voice gruff. "The one who ran off." Emily's heart skipped a beat, her stomach twisting in dread. She leaned in slightly, trying to catch every word. "Yeah," the man continued. "She's part of that deal they made. You know, with the Calloway men. They've been bringing girls in, selling them off to the highest bidder. That one's got no chance. I heard she was sold for $3,000. The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. Sold. She was just like one of those girls, property to be traded, discarded when they were done with her. Her mind raced as the horror of her reality became all too clear. The men who had taken her father's land and manipulated Sarah into selling her had done this before. Emily wasn't the first and she wouldn't be the last. She had been sold, bought and paid for like livestock, and the men who now owned her saw her as nothing more than an object to be used, until she was no longer useful to them. Her hands shook as she pushed her half-eaten toast aside. She had to get out of here. She couldn't let herself fall into their hands again. The realization was brutal, but it was also empowering. Emily had to survive. She couldn't let herself be consumed by fear. These men, these traffickers, they would use her until she broke, but Emily refused to break. She couldn't. As she stood up to leave the diner, her mind was already racing with plans. She had heard enough. The men who were behind this, Calloway and his associates, were too powerful to take on directly. She would have to be smart, stay under the radar, and find a way to escape the town. She knew she couldn't stay in the area for long. The men would be looking for her. But as she stepped out of the diner and into the bright afternoon sun, something inside her hardened. She would not be their victim. For days, Emily stayed hidden in the shadows, moving from town to town, sleeping in abandoned buildings or under the cover of night. She learned to keep a low profile, watching from the sidelines as the world around her continued. But no matter where she went, the specter of what had been done to her lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was constantly being hunted, that at any moment, the men who had bought her could appear and drag her back into the hell from which she had escaped. Her life had become a desperate game of survival. Survival not just of her body, but of her mind and spirit. She was beginning to understand just how easy it was for people to fall into the trap of becoming nothing more than property, a commodity to be traded. But she also realized that the most important part of survival was keeping her humanity intact. Despite the harshness of her reality, Emily was determined not to become like the others, broken and defeated. She would find a way to reclaim her life, to fight back against the men who had stolen everything from her. But the road ahead would not be easy. She would have to find allies, people who could help her navigate the dangerous world she now found herself in. It was only through these connections, these moments of kindness and trust, that Emily could hope to rebuild her life and escape the life of abuse and control that had been thrust upon her. Days turned into weeks, and with every passing hour, Emily's situation became more desperate. She moved with careful precision, staying off the main roads, keeping out of sight of anyone who might recognize her or ask too many questions. The town she had fled from still haunted her. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow she saw flicker at the edge of her vision, made her heart race with fear. Emily was running, not just from the men who had sold her, but from the world that had allowed such horrors to happen. It was on a late afternoon, when Emily was resting in a small abandoned shack on the outskirts of yet another town, that she realized something profound. Her survival wasn't just about avoiding detection anymore. It was about escaping the chains that still bound her. The men who had bought her didn't just own her body. They had stolen something far more important, her sense of freedom. They had tried to strip away her will to fight, to make her feel small, powerless. Emily couldn't allow them to win. No matter how dire her circumstances had become, no matter how much fear gripped her heart, she couldn't let herself stay trapped in this life. She was no longer just running for her life. She was fighting for her future. It wasn't a moment of epiphany, but rather a gradual understanding, a shift in her mindset. Emily realized that she had been given the tools for survival all along. She had learned to read people, to notice details, to watch for patterns. She had learned how to survive on the outskirts of society, to blend in when needed, and to disappear when the danger grew too great. But more than that, she had learned to fight back against her circumstances, even when the odds seemed impossible. The moment she made this realization was the moment her entire perspective changed. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about fighting. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen from her, piece by piece. The next morning, Emily began to plan. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to sit still, to take stock of her resources, and to consider her options. She couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, she would need help. Someone to show her the way. Someone who could help her break free from the life she had been forced into. She needed allies. And she knew where to find them. The plan takes shape. Emily's mind raced as she sketched out her plan. The walls of the small shack around her offering little comfort as the weight of the task ahead grew heavier. The world she had been thrust into was vast, and the dangers that lurked within it seemed insurmountable. Yet she refused to allow herself to be a victim anymore. She would need to find a way out of this trap, and the first step was simple. Make contact with someone who could help her. She had overheard enough in the diner to understand that there were others who had escaped this life. Other girls who had been sold, other victims who had fought back. If she could find them, maybe, just maybe, they could help her in her quest for freedom. But finding these people was not going to be easy. Emily knew that she couldn't rely on the police. The law had failed her already, and the corruption that ran deep in the towns and communities she had passed through made it clear that the authorities were not on her side. But there were other ways, quieter ways, to get in touch with people who knew how to survive, how to fight back. She needed to reach out to the underground networks, the ones that helped women like her escape, women who had been bought, sold, and discarded. These were people who operated in the shadows, people who understood what it was like to be broken and to rebuild. Emily didn't have much, just a small bag of belongings and the clothes on her back, but she had something more important, the will to fight, to survive, and to escape. The question was, where would she go? She couldn't go back to the farm. The men who had been after her were still hunting her, and Sarah, her stepmother, was part of the system that had enslaved her. She had to get as far away as possible, but she also needed a way to move without being detected. She had no family to turn to, no friends who could help. But she had something else. A sharp mind and an eye for detail. She began to think of every place she had been, every town she had crossed. She knew there was a way out. She just had to find it. The decision. That evening, as Emily sat in the stillness of the shack, she made her decision. She would head to a larger city, somewhere far away from the reach of the men who had been chasing her. She had overheard mentions of cities where the underground networks for escaping women operated more freely, and the anonymity of a big city might provide her with the best chance of disappearing into the crowd. New York. It wasn't just a city. It was a beacon of freedom for people like her. It was a city that could offer anonymity, a place where she could rebuild her life away from the horrors of her past. Emily didn't know how she would get there, but she knew it was her only chance. It was a place where the past could be erased, where she could find safety, even if only for a while. The decision was made, and with it came a surge of determination. Emily had her plan, but it wasn't going to be easy. The path ahead was filled with uncertainty and danger. But for the first time since her father's death, Emily felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't running anymore. She was fighting for a new beginning. With a final glance around the small shack, she picked up her belongings and stepped outside. The darkness was thick around her, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid. She had nothing left to lose. The next morning, Emily set her plan into motion. She knew that the road to New York would be long and fraught with danger. Every step she took from here on out would be a calculated risk, a tightrope between freedom and capture. But there was no other choice. She had to go. Emily packed what little she had left. A few pieces of clothing, the small bundle of cash she had left from her time in the cabin, and her father's old pocket knife, which had been one of his few possessions of value. It was the only memento she had of him now, and despite the weight of everything she had lost, she clung to it as a reminder of the love and lessons he had given her. She had thought long and hard about how to travel safely. She couldn't use public transportation. The risk of being caught by the wrong people was too high. It wasn't just the men she was running from. There was always the possibility that someone would recognize her, that a stranger might connect the dots and report her whereabouts. She needed to be discreet, to disappear into the crowd without drawing attention. Her first step was to find a way to leave town undetected. She knew there was a freight train that passed through the outskirts of the town every few days, heading toward larger cities to the north. If she could catch it, she could travel without having to buy a ticket or risk being seen. That morning, Emily walked through the back streets of the town, staying hidden in the shadows of alleyways and behind buildings. She moved quickly but cautiously, her eyes darting around as she made her way to the freight yard. The air was cool and still, and the sounds of the town around her felt distant and muffled. She was an outsider now, no longer a part of this town, no longer a part of the life she had known. But in some strange way, that knowledge empowered her. She was free, at least for the moment. She reached the freight yard just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The train tracks stretched out in front of her, disappearing into the distance, and the faint rumble of the approaching train grew louder. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. the familiar feeling of fear gnawing at her insides. This was it. She was about to make her move, to take the first step toward the freedom she had dreamed of. As the train slowly rolled into the yard, Emily crouched low behind a stack of crates. She waited, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she watched the train's cars move past her, one by one. She could hear the sound of men talking in the distance, but she stayed still, blending into the shadows. She couldn't afford to make a sound. When the train finally stopped, Emily's opportunity came. The cars were long, and she spotted an open boxcar near the end of the train. Her pulse quickened as she crept forward, her body tense with anticipation. This was her chance. She had to act quickly before anyone noticed her. She glanced around once more, ensuring no one was watching, then sprinted to the open boxcar and hoisted herself up. It was a precarious climb, but Emily's determination kept her steady. She slipped into the boxcar, her hands shaking with both fear and excitement. The cold air rushed through the open door, and she pulled it shut behind her, breathing a sigh of relief. She had done it. She was on her way to New York. As the train began to move, Emily sat against the wall of the boxcar, her heart still racing. She tried to calm her breathing, focusing on the sound of the wheels on the tracks as the train picked up speed. The world outside was fading, and she could feel herself being carried away from everything she had known. She didn't know what would await her in New York, but at that moment the only thing that mattered was that she was free. Hours passed and the train rumbled on, carrying her away from the only life she had ever known. Emily couldn't sleep, the fear and adrenaline still running high in her veins. But as the sun began to rise the next morning, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She was escaping. She was leaving behind the horrors of the past, and though the future was uncertain, it was hers to shape. But she knew the road ahead would not be easy. The journey would be long, and the dangers were still real. She had no idea how long it would take to get to New York, but she knew that once she arrived, she would have to start over. She would have to be smart, resourceful, and cautious. She couldn't afford to trust anyone too quickly. For now, though, all she could do was keep moving. And as the miles passed beneath her, Emily couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The hours on the freight train felt like days. Emily had long lost track of time, her body stiff from sitting in the cold, her mind numb with exhaustion. As the train barreled through the countryside, she held on to the small fleeting sense of peace she had gained from escaping. But that peace was fleeting. The reality of what she had done, and the dangers she faced, quickly crept back into her thoughts. She was free for now, but she knew the worst was far from over. The fear of being caught by the men who had bought her still gnawed at her, despite the physical distance she had put between herself and them. Emily wasn't naive. She knew they wouldn't give up easily. The Calloway men were powerful, ruthless, and used to getting what they wanted. She couldn't afford to rest, even for a moment. The thought of them finding her and dragging her back to that life was enough to make her skin crawl. They wouldn't care what she had been through. She would be nothing more than another pawn in their cruel game. Emily had seen enough to know how the world worked when it came to people like her. People who had been discarded, sold off, and treated as nothing more than property. The laws of the world she had come from didn't apply to her anymore. Out here in the wilderness of her new reality, only the strong survived. And she was determined to survive. The train rattled through another small town in the early morning hours, and Emily's eyes widened as she saw flashing lights in the distance. Police cars, maybe. The fear of being recognized surged within her, but she quickly dismissed it. She couldn't afford to be caught now. The closer she got to New York, the more the stakes would rise, and the men behind her would likely begin pulling more strings to track her down. She could feel the tension in her chest tighten as she considered her options. What if they were already looking for her? What if the police were involved? She could only hope that they didn't know enough about her to trace her movements. But there was no time to second-guess herself. If she stayed on the train, she risked being noticed, and if she got off, she risked being caught by those men or someone working for them. With a deep breath, Emily made a decision. She couldn't risk staying on the train any longer. As the train slowed in preparation to stop at a small station, Emily moved quickly. She jumped off, her legs stiff from hours of sitting, but the fear of capture was enough to make her move faster than she thought possible. She hid behind a pile of crates and watched the train disappear into the distance, the sound of the tracks fading into the quiet morning air. Emily took a moment to catch her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The quiet of the small town around her felt both comforting and eerie. She was free from the train, but that only meant she was now in unfamiliar territory with no plan, no resources, and no idea where she was going. But she couldn't stay in one place too long. The longer she lingered, the greater the chance someone would find her. It wasn't long before she noticed a man walking down the street. He was tall, dressed in a heavy coat, and carrying a bag slung over his shoulder. Emily instinctively ducked back into the shadows, watching him carefully. She didn't know if he was a threat or not, but she couldn't take any chances. The man stopped for a moment, looked around, and then entered a nearby diner. Emily's eyes narrowed as she considered the situation. There were people here, strangers, people who had no reason to care about her or her past. But that was the problem. People who had no reason to care were also the most dangerous. She couldn't trust anyone, no matter how innocent they seemed. Emily walked quickly in the opposite direction of the diner, moving toward the outskirts of the town. Her stomach growled in protest. She hadn't eaten in hours, and the exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. She needed food, water, and a place to rest, but she couldn't afford to be reckless. Every step she took could lead to danger, and the last thing she needed was to attract unwanted attention. As she passed through an alleyway, she spotted a small grocery store up ahead. The door was open, and there were no obvious signs of anyone watching. Emily's eyes flicked nervously around the area, but no one seemed to be paying attention to her. This was her chance. She could slip in, grab some supplies, and disappear before anyone noticed. But she had to be quick. She approached the store cautiously, making sure to keep her movements as quiet as possible. As she slipped inside, the bell above the door jingled softly and Emily froze. She waited for a moment, her heart racing, but there was no reaction. The store was quiet, the shelves stocked with food, and there was a sense of peace in the air. Emily quickly grabbed a few items, canned food, water, and some basic necessities, and slipped them into her bag. She had just turned to leave when the sound of footsteps caught her attention. A man had entered the store, and he was walking toward the counter. Her heart raced as she tried to decide what to do. Should she confront him? Or should she make a run for it? There was no time to think. She didn't want to risk being caught here, in this small town where she had no allies. Without a second thought, Emily made a dash for the door. The man glanced up just as she slipped out, but he didn't seem to notice her. She exhaled in relief, her pulse still pounding in her ears as she moved quickly down the street. The danger was real. Every step she took now was a gamble. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't stay in this town. The risk was too great, and the men who were after her wouldn't stop until they had found her. But she was getting closer to New York, and every mile that passed was a victory. The fight for survival was far from over. Emily knew that. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. She was still alive. She was still free. The journey to New York took longer than Emily had expected. The train rides, the nights spent in abandoned buildings, the constant fear of being seen. It all added up. But as the miles passed under her feet, she began to feel a sense of resolve settling in her chest. With every step, she was moving farther away from the life that had tried to destroy her and closer to the possibility of something better. When she finally arrived in New York City, she was exhausted, starving, and more scared than she had ever been. The streets were unfamiliar, the noise of the city overwhelming. But amidst the chaos, she found a strange sense of solace. Here in this vast city she could disappear. She could become just another face in the crowd, lost among the millions of people who walk the streets every day. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life here. Emily didn't know anyone in the city. She had no connections, no friends to turn to. All she had was the small amount of money she had saved and the clothes on her back. She spent the first few nights in a cheap hostel, trying to get some rest before figuring out her next move. Every day she scoured the job listings, looking for anything that might allow her to survive. It wasn't much. Cleaning jobs, waitressing, anything that would keep her off the streets, but it was a start. The city, however, wasn't as welcoming as she had hoped. Despite its vastness and anonymity, Emily found herself constantly on edge, always looking over her shoulder. She had no idea where to go, where to live, or how to find the help she so desperately needed. The fear that had followed her from Kentucky seemed to haunt her even in the hustle and bustle of New York streets. One evening, as she walked back to the hostel after another long day of searching for work, she noticed a flyer tacked to a light pole. It was simple with bold letters that read, "Helping Women in Need, Safe Space for Survivors of Abuse and Trafficking. Call for more information." The phone number was written below, and for the first time in days, Emily felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: relief. She hesitated at first. What if it was a scam? What if it was a trap? But as she stood there, staring at the number, something told her that this was the break she had been waiting for. She couldn't afford to ignore it. That night, after a fitful sleep, Emily made the call. The voice on the other end was kind, reassuring, and professional. She explained her situation briefly, enough to let the person know that she needed help, but not too much that she would risk revealing too much too soon. The woman on the other end of the phone promised that someone would meet her at a nearby community center the next morning. The next day, Emily arrived at the address the woman had given her, her heart racing as she stepped inside. The center was small but warm, and the people there immediately made her feel at ease. She wasn't just another statistic. She was a human being who deserved help, who deserved a chance at healing. Emily spent the next few days at the center, speaking to a counselor, getting the resources she needed to begin rebuilding her life. She learned about support networks for survivors of trafficking, and she began attending meetings with other women who had gone through similar experiences. For the first time in months, she felt like she wasn't alone. These women had faced horrors just as she had, but they had survived. They had fought back, and they were now helping others do the same. In a small room at the community center, Emily allowed herself to finally break down. She cried for everything she had lost, for everything that had been taken from her. She cried for the father she had lost, for the life she had left behind, and for the woman she had been before all of this. But as she wept, something else began to surface, the realization that she was not defined by her past. She was not defined by the pain, the suffering, or the trauma. She was defined by her strength, and she was still standing. Over the next few months, Emily slowly began to rebuild her life. She found a job working at a local diner, doing the same work she had done back in Kentucky, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. She moved into a small apartment and began to make a life for herself, though the fear of being found still loomed in the back of her mind. But as time went on, Emily's perspective began to shift. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. She had found a sense of community with the women at the center, and they had become her family. They had supported her through the darkest moments, and now she was ready to give back. She began volunteering at the center, helping other women who were in the same position she had once been in. She shared her story, spoke to those who were still struggling, and offered them the same support she had received when she first walked through those doors. Emily's work with the center became her life's purpose. She helped survivors navigate the system, find safe housing, and reconnect with their sense of identity. She shared her story not for pity, but to show others that healing was possible. The journey had been long, painful, and often terrifying, but Emily knew that her survival was a testament to the strength that lay within all of them. As the years passed, Emily continued to advocate for survivors of human trafficking. She spoke at conferences, worked with lawmakers to improve protections for victims, and used her story to raise awareness. But it was the work she did one-on-one with the women who came through the center that meant the most. She became a symbol of hope for so many, proof that no matter what had happened in the past, the future was always worth fighting for. And as she stood before a room full of women, sharing her journey and listening to theirs, Emily realized something that she had not known before. Survival was not just about escaping. It was about taking that pain, that suffering, and turning it into something beautiful. A new life, a new purpose, and a new chance at happiness. Emily had survived, and now she was helping others survive too. End of the story. Thank you for following along with Emily's journey.